Well, brothers and sisters, little story. I was, I think, 10 or 11 years old, and I went on a camping trip with the boys from our church. And I remember there's a group of us, well, the whole group was, I think we were eating dinner together or whatever, and so it was a group of boys, probably 4th grade all the way up through 8th grade, and I was maybe in the 5th or 6th grade. So I and my friends were on the younger side of things. And one of my friends started telling a story, and I think he wanted to kind of make the older kids laugh and kind of get their attention. So he started telling a story, and sure enough, it worked. It made everyone laugh. The only problem is the story was about me. And don't feel too bad. I'm okay. The story was about me, and it was a story pretty embarrassing. I had told my friend this, and I asked him to just keep it in confidence. Don't tell anybody. And so then when I looked over, he's telling the story, and I looked over at him kind of in horror, like, what are you doing? Don't tell that. But it was too late. The story was out, and then everybody's laughing at me. And I just, at the time, again, I assure you, I've worked through all this. I'm good. But at the time, I remember it was kind of this humiliating, terrifying moment, and I felt that my friend had really let me down. Now, I don't know if you've had an experience like that. Probably at some point in your life, you have, to a greater or to a lesser degree. Maybe it was, someone that you counted on, like in my case, you counted on to just keep your confidence. You didn't want them sharing something, and they went and told everyone. And rumor gets back to you, word gets back to you, and you're just embarrassed and humiliated. Or maybe it's someone, they just kind of throw you under the bus. Maybe it's at work or something like that at school, and you're hoping that they're going to come to your defense. You're hoping that they're going to stand up and sort of defend you, but instead they try to save their own skin, and you get in trouble. You take all the heat, and you kind of look over and you think, why did you do that? What kind of a person are you? All right, you've all probably been in a situation a little like that, and if you have, you can maybe imagine just a little bit of what Jesus was experiencing. Now, nothing to that extreme, but you can at least understand and begin to grasp what it means that Jesus looked over at Peter when Peter said, I don't even know who that man is. You can begin to imagine, you begin to sense what a painful moment that was for Jesus. Now, it's interesting, later on in the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul, when he's actually talking to the Corinthian church, and actually he's talking about the Lord's Supper. And you might remember one of the things that Paul does is he looks back on this night, and he doesn't say it was the night in which Jesus was arrested. He doesn't say it was the night in which Jesus was put on trial. He doesn't say it was the night in which Jesus gave up his life even. He says it was what? It was the night in which Jesus was betrayed. In other words, Paul looks back at this night of Jesus' arrest, and one of the defining moments, one of the defining experiences for Jesus that night was the betrayal of his friends. We already looked at when Judas hands Jesus over to be crucified. But in a sense, Peter's denial is another form of betrayal. It's a betrayal of a relationship, of a friendship. Now, in order for us to really understand why this is such a defining moment and why it's such an important moment, we have to take a moment and try to make sense of what our promises really are, right? Peter's commitment to Jesus, in a sense, was a promise, and I'm going to show you a little more about what that was in a moment, but Peter's commitment to Jesus was built on a promise. And so the denial that Peter makes is really the breaking of a promise. And we need to take a moment and we need to understand the role that promises play in our lives. They're not just empty words. Promises they actually define the kind of people that we become. They define us. The promises that you and I make define the kind of people that we become, right? Promises join us. A lot of times promises join us to other people. They create relationship, and then they begin to shape our character. And I realize in some ways that sounds kind of abstract. So let's see if we can make it a little more concrete. If you stand up front of the church and you look at your fiancé and you make a promise that you will to have and to hold from this day forward, no matter what. You're making a promise, and that promise joins you to that other person. And you know what? That promise is going to shape how you live the rest of your life. If you promise that you're going to love someone in sickness and in health, for better, for worse, and richer, for poorer, you know what? That means that that person becomes your priority. They become the person that you're going to put their needs ahead of your own. That promise begins to shape you. That promise begins to define who you are. This morning, Andrew and Cheryl stood up here and they made a promise, and we as a church made a promise. And that promise actually is going to kind of shape the kind of home that Andrew and Cheryl commit to making. It's going to shape the kind of home and kind of church that we are. Right? A promise to nurture children in the faith. If we take that promise seriously, that's going to create a culture of our church that is bent on telling the story of Jesus, instructing our children, praying for them, valuing them. That's a promise that will define who we are as a church. Now let's look at that a step further. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? What does it mean to be a Christian? To be a Christian means that you're making a commitment. You're making a commitment to following Jesus. You're making a promise to Him. Jesus actually says in Mark chapter 8, verse 34, He says, if anyone wants to be my disciple, they have to take up their cross and follow me. So being a Christian isn't just about having correct doctrinal beliefs, although that matters, that's important. But being a Christian is a commitment to Jesus Christ. It's a promise, in a sense, to follow Him and to be loyal to Him. And if we look at the life of Peter, Peter is one. Peter, he's quick to speak, and then he kind of thinks about it a little later on, it seems. Earlier in John's Gospel, if you go back to John chapter 13, you can write this down and look it up later if you like. In John 13, verse 36 to 38, Peter makes a promise to Jesus. Jesus and His disciples are all standing around, and Jesus begins to share with His disciples that He is going to have to lay down His life and die. And then Jesus takes it a step further. Jesus says, you know what? You disciples, all of you are going to fall away. And that's when Peter opens his mouth. And he makes a promise. He says, Lord, if everyone else falls away, not me. I'm not going to fall away. In fact, Jesus, you can count on me. I'll die for you, Jesus. That's a promise that Peter makes. That's a commitment that Peter makes. And now we fast forward just a few chapters, and John chapter 18, John picks up that promise, and he shows us what happens. Now I want to take you through a couple of the details of this story because they, I think, shine a light on what happens when we break our promises. Look with me first at verses 16 and 17. It seems that Peter follows Jesus from his trial from one place to the next. And then John tells us that there was another disciple there, but he doesn't give the name. Most scholars think that was John himself. Get no proof of it, but we're just going to go on that assumption. We're going to say it's John and Peter who follow Jesus along to the home of the high priest, where Jesus is going to be put on trial again. And John, it seems, has an in with the high priest. It seems that maybe someone in his family or he himself had some connection that allowed him to go into the home of the high priest. But Peter didn't have those connections, and so Peter is forced to stay outside and to wait. And John maybe feels bad for Peter, so John goes back and talks to some people and says, no, we got to let Peter in too. Let him in. I know who he is. And so John talks to the servant girl, and Peter is brought in the door. And that's when that servant girl asks a question. Servant girl says, you don't know who Jesus is, do you? And you notice the way that she phrases the question. This servant girl is actually expecting Peter to say, no, I don't know who he is. Servant girl isn't really suspicious of Peter in that moment. The question is phrased in such a way she expects a negative answer from Peter. In other words, Peter really just has to go along with the flow here, right? For Peter to deny Jesus, he's just kind of going along with what people around him were thinking. Because the second time Peter is asked the same question. You don't know who he is, do you? And again, Peter just kind of goes along with it. And I think you could make the case that Peter goes along with it for a reason. Maybe in Peter's mind he rationalizes this. Pay attention to this, because this is often how we find ourselves in a similar situation, right? You can imagine Peter thinking to himself, you know what? If I want to get in and be close to Jesus, if I want to stand by Jesus' side, I need to bend the truth a little bit. I need to just kind of go along with the current. I need to just kind of pretend I don't know him, but that's going to serve a greater purpose. Maybe that's how Peter rationalized it to himself. It was kind of a pragmatic move. Deny Jesus here for a greater purpose, for a greater goal, to get in the door. People don't think you know Jesus anyways. What's the harm? Now, John Calvin, when he writes about this text, he makes an interesting observation. He says, you know, the way that sin works is the first time is the most difficult. You had that experience, right? The first time you do something wrong, you know it's wrong, your conscience is there, you feel really uncomfortable, but you do it anyways. And then Calvin goes on, he says the second time it's a little easier, because you're a little more used to it. By the third time it becomes a habit. And Calvin says, he suggests that that's what's happening here. The first time was the hardest, and then the second time was a little easier. The third time, now Peter's just gotten into the habit. He's just gotten into the routine. So by verse 26 and 27, verse 25, Peter says, no, I don't know who he is. And then again, verse 27, the third time, Peter just denies it. See how easy that happens? Now, why does this matter for us? Well, because at some point, you and I are going to be in that position. At some point, you and I are going to be in that position where we're at a crossroads. Do you speak up, or do you just go with the current? Do you stand by your convictions and your commitment to obedience, discipleship of Jesus Christ, or just go along with what everybody else thinks and just keep quiet? You know, for some of you, it might be you speak up and you tell the truth, and you risk losing your job. You risk losing your reputation. It might cost you a promotion. For some of you, it might cost a relationship, a friendship, a romantic relationship. You hold fast to your commitment to Jesus and all that he calls us to, and you know that that's actually going to be the end of a relationship, because deep down you know that relationship is not what Jesus has for you. It's not what he wants. Some of you, I'll throw in another one because I'm not sure we always think of this one. In the New Testament, I'll just give you the verses. You can go and look them up later. Titus 1:16 and 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. These are important because they make the similar point. Paul in the New Testament, he says, if you fail to care for the poor among you, you are denying Jesus Christ. And I put that one out in front of you because I'm not sure. I know for myself, that's not one that I usually think of. I don't usually think of neglecting the poor quite in those terms. That's what Paul says. If you're indifferent to the poor, you are denying Jesus Christ. And I hear that and I think, ooh. Right? And so the point is, at some point, you or I will be faced with this kind of crossroads moment. What do you do? Now look at what Peter does. We already know how it happens, but I want to unpack what's really going on, because what happens when we break our promises? What happens when we violate our commitments? I want to show you something. Look with me, if you would, at verse 17. You are not one of his disciples, are you? And Peter replies, I am not. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at the story when Jesus was arrested. And I told you then, and I shared with you then, that Jesus, they asked, we're looking for Jesus. The soldiers say, we're looking for Jesus. And Jesus says, I am. I am he. And I told you at that moment that was kind of the way Jesus was revealing himself to be God. He's using the divine name for himself, the name, I am who I am. This is my nature. And that stands in such sad contrast to what Peter says. Peter says, I am not. Now there's a hint there. There's kind of an underlying idea that actually when Peter says, I am not, what he's really doing is he's actually sort of denying his very self. His integrity has been compromised. Right? Integrity is the idea that we are whole people, right? That we are consistent. We act consistently according to our beliefs. And a lack of integrity means that we are inconsistent. And Peter, when he says, I am not, it's kind of like he's showing that he's inconsistent in his very nature. To put it a little bit differently, when we violate our promises, when we don't keep our commitments, it's not just that we've made a little mistake, it's that actually we've compromised our very integrity. You're faced with a question, who are you? You make a commitment to following Jesus, to obeying Him and serving Him and submitting to Him, and then you kind of break those promises whenever it's convenient, then who are you? Are you the person who keeps the commitments and is loyal to Jesus? Are you the person who talks about how important Jesus is and how much you love Him and you want to serve Him? Or are you the person that when the heat is on, you deny it, pretend you don't know Him, pretend you're someone else? Who are you? See? It's a lack of integrity, and it's deep internal conflict. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie Liar, Liar. It was back in the 90s. I can't come up in front of you and tell you and wholeheartedly endorse this for you, okay? So that's my little disclaimer. There's some stuff in there that probably is not so wholesome, but on the whole, the movie wrestles with a pretty important question. Question of truth and integrity. And you have in this movie, you have a father who makes all kinds of promises to his son. I'm going to be there. I'll pick you up after school. I love you. And, we're going to have fun together. But you know what? This father never keeps his promises. He doesn't really think much of it. Makes lots of promises, keeps almost none of them. And then the boy, the poor kid, he's so heartbroken over this. It's his birthday, and then he makes a wish. He says, I wish that my father can never tell a lie for a whole day. And so about half the movie is kind of all the fun that comes out of that and the, slapstick humor and so on. But then there's this moment where the father, he says, I'm a lousy father. And he kind of just blurts it out, and then it dawns on him that he can't tell a lie. And all of a sudden it hits him that he is a lousy father. And it's this sort of moment of crisis. Because here, all this time, he's talked about how great of a dad he is, and all of a sudden the truth comes out. He's broken all of his promises. He doesn't know who he is anymore. That's what happens when we don't keep our commitments and we don't keep our promises. Now listen, some of you are sitting here and you're thinking, boy, Pastor's being really hard on us today. Talking about we don't keep promises and how difficult it is, and you know what, I get that. You might even be sitting here, you might be wondering, how can I ever live up to this? You make a commitment to following Jesus Christ. How can you keep that commitment? In fact, some of you are sitting here and you know all too well you haven't kept that commitment. You can think of a moment when you were in the crossroads and you went with the current. You didn't speak up when you should have. All your friends said, hey, come on and join us this weekend. And you knew very well what they were going to be doing. And rather than say, no, you guys go ahead, not me, you said, sure, let's go. And you went with the current. And you experienced that conflict within, that angst, that sense of, I'm not who I pretend to be. You've been there. So what do you do? What do you do? You wonder even, has Jesus given up on me? Is he tired of dealing with me? I make all these promises to Him and I don't keep them, and now Jesus is about done with me. You might feel that way. I want to show you two absolutely crucial details in this story. Because this story, yes, it's about a failure, but I want you to know, and I need you to hear that this story is about God's grace for disciples who blow it big time. Look with me, verse 18. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. And Peter was standing there with himself also. You're thinking, big deal. Just telling us that it was a little cold out and the people made a fire. There's a couple of Greek words they have for fire, just like in English. You got bonfire, you got campfire, and so on and so forth. The Greek word used here is, it's a word, it's only used twice in the New Testament. It's a word, it just means what it says. It's like a fire of coals. It's not a bonfire. It's a real small thing, and it's kind of on the ground. You just kind of huddle around it. It gives off enough warmth that a few people can keep warm. First time it occurs in the New Testament is right here. Some of you might have a guess as the second time it appears. You just have to turn over a few pages. You don't have to do it now, but it's in John 21 or 22. It's after the resurrection. And guess who shows up on the beach? Disciples are out, they're off fishing. And it's Jesus who shows up on the beach. And guess what Jesus does? He builds a fire. Second time that word is used. It's a little coal fire. And you know what Jesus does? He invites his disciples, and he singles out Peter. He says, Peter, come here, come around this fire. And once again, Peter is standing around a fire. This time, Peter isn't denying Jesus. Jesus asks the questions, and Jesus asks 3 questions for each denial. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you really love me? And 3 times, Peter says, yes. Yes, I do. Yes, you know that I do. And 3 times, Jesus says, then feed my sheep. Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Here's the point. John is already foreshadowing this. He's already pointing us to this. He wants us to know that Jesus forgives fickle disciples. Jesus forgives his followers when they fail time and time and time and time again. He forgives and he reinstates. You will fail. You're not going to always make it as a disciple. There are going to be moments where you really, really mess up. Remember the fire. Remember that little campfire. Just remember what Jesus does to restore his fallen disciples. The second thing you need to know and to do is this. When you're in that crossroads moment, when you're in that moment, do you stand up against the current or do you go with the current? Here's what you need to ask yourself. What are you really after? And here's what I mean by that. When Peter is with the other disciples and Jesus starts telling them, John 13, I'm going to be suffering and I'm going to die. And Peter says, oh no, I'm going to go with you all the way to death. You know what Peter was really after? Peter was serving himself. He was making a promise really more for himself. He's trying to look better than all the other disciples. He's trying to impress Jesus with how committed and how faithful he was. He wanted to stand out as the best disciple. Peter wasn't really interested in a commitment to Jesus. Peter was interested in a commitment to himself. And if we're honest, when we're in that crossroads moment, we care. One of the things that can happen is we care more about what the boss thinks, what our, if you're on a date, what your date thinks, what your friends think. You want the approval of your class. When you're in that moment of temptation, ask yourself, what am I really after? What do I value here? And the reason that I tell you that is because really, what Peter really needed wasn't kind of a pep talk. It wasn't, Peter, hey, get out there and next time try a little harder. There was something fundamentally wrong with Peter's heart, something fundamentally wrong with our heart. And that was that his heart was turned in on itself. He needed a new heart. He needed a changed heart. We need a changed heart. If we're going to take seriously our commitment to Jesus, we need a heart that is changed by the gospel. We need a heart that actually looks at what God has done for us. And that's what happens after the resurrection. Peter begins to see the whole picture. He begins to see that God was faithful to him, that God kept his promise to him even at the expense of his own life. Right, and we have that too. That's what changes us today. You look at what did it cost God to keep his promises to you. We read this morning from Genesis 12 when God makes that promise to Abraham, I will love you, you will be my people, I will claim you as my own, I will bless you. What did it cost God to keep that promise? Cost him everything. Cost him the life of his son. And when you begin to grasp that, when that becomes real to your heart, that changes you. That makes you see that you are loved by God. In other words, keeping our promises is not so much about an exercise of the will. It's not like go out and try hard and be a good, faithful follower of Jesus and just really put your whole energy into it. It's saying, look at what God has done for me. Look at how God keeps His promises to me. Right? When we baptize little Anna Grace, what does her salvation depend on? Does it depend on how well we're keeping our promise? Well, God uses our promises. But her salvation depends on God keeping His promise. It's His faithfulness to His people. You know, I started and I told you that Paul, when he looks back at the Lord's Supper, he calls it the night in which Jesus was betrayed. It was that experience that became the defining moment, in a sense, for Paul. When he looks back at the Lord's Supper, he says, that night was the night in which Jesus was betrayed. But you know what? I only read the little first part of that sentence. Yes, it was the night in which Jesus was betrayed. But Paul goes on, says it was the night in which Jesus was betrayed that He took the bread and He looked at His disciples in the face. He looked at Peter and He looked at Judas and He looked at James and He looked at John, and He knew full well that every last one of them would let Him down. But you know what? Jesus said, I break the bread. This is my body for you. The commitment that God makes to us is in spite of our lack of faithfulness. It's a commitment that God keeps. In baptism, in the Lord's Supper, the commitments we make are all a response to the promises that God makes. God joins Himself to us in a promise. His promises define who we are. Let's respond in obedience. Let's respond by committing ourselves to Jesus in obedience and submission, because He has committed Himself to us. Let's pray. Lord our God, we thank You that You are a God who makes promise. You are faithful to those promises. Lord, we thank You that even when we fail to keep our commitments to You, You don't back down. You remain faithful to us. Lord, when we're in that crossroads moment, when we're in that moment where we can either speak up and stand by our convictions and stand by our loyalty to You, or just go along with the crowd, we pray that You'd help us to remember that we already have the love and approval that matters more than anything else. We have Your blessing. We have Your favor. And so we don't need to worry what others think of us. We can be bold in our conviction to You. And Lord, when we waver and when we fail, Lord, help us to remember that You don't give up on us. You still love us. You are still faithful to us. Let that promise not only reassure us and comfort us, but let that promise drive our loyalty and our commitment and obedience to You. In Christ we pray. Amen. Let's stand together and sing our song of response, Lord, I Need You.